The oars cut black water. 18 men pulled in rhythm, backs bent against the North Atlantic's fury. Their breath came out in white clouds that froze before they could dissipate. Sleet hammered the deck. Ice formed on the gunwales, thick as a man's thumb. The longship groaned, wood flexing, straining, alive with the strain of forward motion through water so cold it could stop a heart in minutes. No torch burned, no brazier glowed, not a single ember flickered aboard that vessel. The men wore layers of wool and fur so stiff with frost they crackled when they moved. Their beards were white with ice. Their fingers, wrapped tight around oar handles, had long since lost feeling. Above them, the sail, a massive rectangle of wool soaked in animal fat, hung heavy and dark against the moonlit sky. They had been at sea for 11 days, and they would survive. This is not the Viking story you were told. The horned helmets? Fiction. The berserker rage? Exaggerated. The image of wild men sailing drunk into battle with fire blazing on deck and mead sloshing in their cups? Pure fantasy. The truth is stranger and darker. Because these men, these raiders, traders, explorers who crossed frozen seas from Norway to Newfoundland, who navigated waters that killed entire crews of later European explorers, did something that should have been impossible. They survived the cold without fire for weeks, sometimes months. Hollywood lied to you. Every Viking movie you've ever seen shows the same thing. Warriors huddled around roaring fires on their ships, flames dancing against the night, warmth and light keeping the darkness at bay. It's dramatic. It's cinematic. It never happened. Archaeologists have excavated dozens of Viking ships, perfectly preserved vessels pulled from Norwegian fjords, Danish harbors, Swedish burial mounds, the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, the Skuldlev Rex. Vessels that sailed 1,000 years ago, their wood still intact, their structures still telling stories. Not one, not a single ship has ever been found with evidence of a hearth, a stove, a fire pit, or even traces of ash. Nothing. The Vikings crossed the most hostile waters on Earth in wooden vessels they deliberately kept flame-free. They voyaged through storms that could snap a mast like kindling, through fog so thick a man couldn't see his own hand, through seas where the spray froze solid on contact. And they did it in the dark. No fire to cook with, no fire to dry clothes, no fire to warm frozen hands or thaw frostbitten toes. Just wood, wool, and will. How? That's the question that haunts every historian who studies Norse seafaring. How did human beings survive conditions that would kill a modern sailor equipped with thermal gear and emergency beacons? How did they cross the North Atlantic, a body of water so savage it still claims lives today, in open boats with nothing but medieval technology and whatever knowledge they carried in their heads? The answer has been hiding in plain sight for centuries. Buried in saga fragments, encoded in ship design, woven into the very fabric they wore. The Vikings didn't just survive the cold, they mastered it. They turned the frozen sea into their highway, their hunting ground, their empire's backbone. But the method, the actual technique, the dark knowledge that let them do the impossible, that's been lost. Until now. Before we go further, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't just history, this is survival science from an age when getting it wrong meant death. These weren't primitive people stumbling through the dark. These were engineers, strategists, masters of their environment who figured out how to bend nature to their will without the luxury of modern technology. If you want to know how they did it, if you want to understand the secret that's been locked away in Norse culture for a millennium, then subscribe. Sit back, because this story goes places you won't expect. This is the truth about the Vikings, and it starts with fear.
The date, sometime around 950 CE. The location, somewhere between the Shetland Islands and the coast of Iceland, a merchant vessel carrying 32 souls through water the color of slate. The wind had died. That was the first problem. When the wind died, the men rowed. When the men rowed, they generated heat, body heat, the only heat they had. Sweat soaked into wool layers. Wool held moisture. Moisture froze when they stopped. The second problem was the fog. It rolled in from the east, thick and white and absolute. Visibility dropped to nothing. The helmsman steered by instinct and prayer, one hand on the tiller, eyes straining for any hint of coastline, rocks, other vessels. In fog like this, ships vanished. Crews rowed in circles until exhaustion or starvation took them. The third problem was the cold itself. Air temperature, well below freezing. Water temperature, barely above. The sea around them was a living threat, a presence that wanted in. It wanted through the wool, through the skin, into the bones. It wanted to stop hearts and still lungs, and turned living men into frozen statues slumped over oars. One of the younger crew members, a boy, really, maybe 16, started shaking. Not normal shivering, the deep, uncontrollable convulsions of hypothermia setting in. His lips had gone blue, his words came out slurred. The man beside him noticed, said something sharp in Old Norse. Others turned to look. Someone called for the sleeping sacks. They pulled the boy from his oar, wrapped him in layers of hide and fur, and wedged him between two older men in the center of the ship. Body heat, the cure and the prevention. The boy would live because the men around him were warm enough to share. But here's what didn't happen. No one lit a fire. No one even suggested it. Because fire aboard a Viking ship wasn't just dangerous, it was suicide. Think about what a longship was made of. Oak planks overlapped and riveted together in a technique called clinker building. Each plank sealed with a mixture of pine tar and animal fat. The gaps between planks stuffed with wool or moss, then coated with more tar to keep water out. The sail, wool, sometimes linen, always treated with fat, wax, or tallow to make it water resistant. The ropes, hemp, treated with tar. The cargo, dried fish, salted meat, wool bales, barrels of ale or mead, all of it packed tight in a wooden hull barely 6 feet wide. Now, imagine a spark, one ember from a torch, one flame from a lamp, one moment of carelessness. The tar catches first. It's designed to repel water, which means it loves fire. Flames race along the seams between planks, following the tar like a fuse. The 18 feet of fat-soaked fabric goes up like kindling. The ropes ignite. The cargo catches. In minutes, the entire ship is burning, in open water, miles from shore. No lifeboats, no rescue, just 32 men and a floating inferno they can't escape because jumping into the water means freezing to death in under 10 minutes. Fire didn't warm Vikings at sea. Fire killed them. This wasn't speculation. This was law. Old Norse legal codes, texts like the Gragas from Iceland and the Gulathing law from Norway, explicitly forbade open flames aboard ships. The language was stark. Fire at sea was treated like mutiny, like sabotage, like murder, because that's what it was. In the sagas, those sprawling epic tales of Viking exploits, there are stories of ships lost to fire. Not many, because most ships that burned didn't have survivors to tell the tale, but the few that survived in oral tradition carried a clear message. Fire at sea was death. One saga describes a drunk crew member lighting a pipe below deck. The ship burned. Everyone died. Another tells of an accidental spark from a tool striking metal. Same result. The Vikings didn't write no smoking signs. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. Fire was the enemy. The sea was cold, yes. The sea was brutal. But the sea could be managed. Fire could not.
So they made a choice. They chose cold over flame. They chose darkness over light. They shivered in wet wool over the warmth of a single candle. And somehow, through methods that still baffle modern researchers, they survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They crossed the Atlantic. They settled Iceland, Greenland, Newfoundland. They raided England, Ireland, France. They traded with Byzantium and Baghdad. They sailed rivers into Russia and founded cities. All of it done without fire at sea. The question isn't whether they did it. The archaeological and historical record is clear. They did. The question is how. What did the Vikings know that we don't? What techniques, what technology, what secret knowledge allowed them to turn their greatest weakness into their greatest strength? The answer isn't simple. It's layered, complex, built on everything from textile science to ship engineering to social structure to religious belief. The Vikings didn't defeat the cold with one trick. They defeated it with a system, an integrated approach to survival that touched every aspect of their maritime culture. And at the center of that system was a simple, brutal truth. If fire was death at sea, what did the Vikings know that we don't? The ship was a bomb waiting for a spark. That's not metaphor, that's engineering reality. Every Viking longship was built from materials specifically chosen for flexibility, strength, and water resistance. Those same materials made them catastrophically flammable. Start with the hull. Oak was the wood of choice, dense, strong, resistant to rot. But oak alone won't keep water out. Wood swells when wet, yes, but the seams between planks still need sealing. The Vikings used pine tar for this, lots of it. Gallons of the stuff, heated until it liquefied, then painted into every gap, every joint, every place where water might penetrate. Pine tar is distilled tree resin. It's sticky, it's waterproof, it's also extremely flammable. Modern boats use synthetic sealants, materials engineered to resist ignition. Viking ships were coated in what was essentially medieval napalm. The tar dried into a hard, waxy finish that could catch fire from a spark and burn hot enough to ignite the wood beneath it. Then there was the sail. A Viking sail measured roughly 18 feet wide by 30 feet tall. That's 540 square feet of fabric. The material was wool, thick, tightly woven, almost felt-like in texture. Wool alone won't hold wind efficiently, so the Vikings treated their sails with animal fat. Seal fat, whale blubber, sheep tallow, whatever was available. The fat was rendered down and worked into the wool fiber by fiber, turning the sail into the world's largest oil lamp. Fat burns. Everyone knows this. Anyone who's ever seen bacon grease catch fire in a pan understands the principle. Now scale that up to 540 square feet of fat-impregnated wool hanging 30 feet above a wooden deck coated in tar. One spark near that sail, and the entire ship becomes a torch. The ropes didn't help. Viking ships used hemp rope for everything, securing the sail, lashing cargo, tying down equipment. Hemp is strong, flexible, and relatively water-resistant. It's also, like everything else on a longship, treated with tar to prevent rot. So the rigging that held the ship together was essentially made of fuses. A fire starting in the rigging wouldn't just burn, it would spread. The flames would race along the ropes, reaching every part of the ship in seconds. The sail would catch, the deck would catch, the cargo would catch. Men would be trapped in a web of burning rope with nowhere to run. This wasn't theoretical danger. This was demonstrated fact. Experimental archaeology, modern researchers building and sailing replica Viking ships, has confirmed what the Norse knew instinctively. Even a small fire aboard a clinker-built, tar-sealed longship spreads faster than men can react. Once flames reach the tar seams, containment becomes impossible. You can't throw water on burning tar, it doesn't help. The tar floats on water, still burning, spreading the fire further.
You can't smother tar flames with fabric. Fabric catches fire. You can't beat tar flames out with bare hands. That's just burning yourself. The only effective response to fire on a Viking ship was to abandon ship immediately and hope you were close enough to shore to swim. Except swimming in the North Atlantic without protective gear meant death in minutes. So fire didn't just threaten the ship, it guaranteed casualties. It was a death sentence with no appeal, no second chances, no survival options. The Vikings understood this completely, and they built their entire maritime culture around avoiding it. The laws were explicit. In the Gulathing Law, one of the oldest surviving legal codes from medieval Norway, there's a section dealing with conduct aboard ships. The language is blunt. Any man who brings fire aboard a vessel at sea commits a crime equivalent to arson. Arson, in Norse society, was one of the worst offenses imaginable. It ranked with murder. Houses could be rebuilt, yes, but burning a man's home, burning his family inside it, was an attack on the social order itself. Bringing fire aboard a ship was treated the same way. Because a ship wasn't just property, it was a community's lifeline. Lose the ship, lose the cargo, lose the crew, and entire settlements could starve. One idiot with a torch could destroy months of work, thousands of man-hours, dozens of lives. So the laws were harsh. Deliberately starting a fire at sea? Outlawry. Exile. Lose all property, all rights, all protection under law. You became unpersoned, fair game for anyone who wanted to kill you. Accidentally starting a fire through negligence? Massive fines, enough to bankrupt families. The guilty party would be paying compensation for years. Even possessing items that could start a fire, tinder boxes, fire steels, oil lamps, was restricted. Ships carried tools, yes, but they were kept in waterproof containers, locked away, guarded like weapons. Because they were weapons. A fire steel in careless hands was a loaded gun. The sagas reinforced this obsession with fire safety through stories. In the saga of Grettir the Strong, there's a scene where a ship's crew nearly mutinies after one man is caught trying to light a small lamp below deck. The man argues he was just trying to see his belongings in the dark. The crew doesn't care. They throw him overboard. The saga treats this as reasonable. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, a drunk crewman stumbles and knocks over a container of whale oil. The oil spills across the deck. Someone nearby has a fire steel. The oil doesn't ignite this time, but the drunk man is beaten unconscious and left tied to the mast for the rest of the voyage as punishment. Again, the saga presents this as just. These weren't barbaric overreactions. These were survival instincts encoded into story. The Vikings used their oral tradition to teach children, to remind adults, to drill into every person who ever set foot on a ship, fire equals death. The fear was cultural. It was passed down through generations, reinforced by law, mythology, and bitter experience. Vikings feared fire at sea more than they feared drowning, more than they feared enemy attacks, more than they feared starvation, because fire was certain death. Drowning was at least quick. But fear alone doesn't explain how they survived. Understanding why they couldn't use fire is one thing, actually managing without it, living for weeks in sub-freezing temperatures with no way to generate artificial heat, that's another matter. Modern survival experts say 3 hours in extreme cold without shelter is fatal, 3 days without water, 3 weeks without food. These are the rules, the baseline assumptions of human endurance. The Vikings broke those rules routinely. They voyaged through conditions that would trigger hypothermia alarms on modern vessels. They slept in open boats while sleet turned to ice on their bodies. They worked with wet hands in freezing wind, performing tasks that required fine motor control, tying knots, adjusting rigging, navigating by stars barely visible through cloud cover. And they did it without fire.
Which means they had something else, some method, some technique, some combination of technology and knowledge that let them convert the human body into a furnace. They turned themselves into their own heat sources. They burned calories the way a fire burns wood, generating warmth from within. But how? Clothing is part of the answer. Diet is another part. Ship design plays a role. Social structure matters. Mythology even factors in. The way the Vikings thought about cold, heat, and survival shaped their practical responses. None of these things alone would be enough. Together, though, woven into a single coherent system, they created a survival strategy that worked so well it let the Vikings dominate the North Atlantic for 3 centuries. They didn't conquer the cold in spite of having no fire. They conquered it because they had no fire. Because fire made them weak. Fire made them dependent. Fire made them vulnerable. The Vikings chose a harder path. They mastered restraint as completely as they mastered violence. They learned to control their environment through discipline, through preparation, through 1,000 small techniques that built on each other until cold became something they could endure. Not just endure, weaponize. While their enemies huddled around fires on shore, the Vikings moved through frozen darkness like ghosts. They struck from the sea at dawn when frost still coated the ground, when no one expected an attack because no sane person would be on the water in those conditions. But the Vikings weren't insane. They were prepared. They knew something the rest of the medieval world didn't. Fire was a crutch. Fire was a weakness. Fire tied you to one place, made you visible, made you predictable. Cold, though, cold could be mastered. And once mastered, it became armor. The secret starts with fabric. Human skin loses heat fast. Bare skin in freezing wind develops frostbite in minutes. Wet skin loses heat 25 times faster than dry skin. The human body is a terrible insulator on its own. We're tropical animals, designed for savanna heat, not Arctic cold. So the Vikings built a second skin. Not one layer, many layers, each with a specific purpose, each contributing to a system that trapped heat close to the body while letting moisture escape. Start from the inside out. First layer, linen undergarments. Linen against bare skin wicks moisture away from the body. Sweat, the body's cooling mechanism, becomes the enemy in cold climates. Let sweat sit on skin, and evaporative cooling kicks in, dropping core temperature. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Linen touched skin, linen absorbed sweat, linen kept skin dry. Second layer, wool. This is where the genius starts. Wool is a miracle fabric for cold weather survival. The fibers are naturally crimped, creating millions of tiny air pockets. Air is an excellent insulator. Body heat warms the air trapped in wool, creating a barrier against external cold. But wool's real advantage is something modern hikers and mountaineers still rely on. Wool retains insulating properties even when wet. Cotton kills. That's a survival mantra. Get cotton wet in cold weather, and it becomes a heat sink, sucking warmth from your body. Wool, though, can absorb up to 30% of its weight in moisture and still keep you warm. The Vikings wore wool as a second skin. Wool tunics, wool leggings, wool undergarments over the linen. Thick, tightly woven fabric that might weigh 5 or 6 pounds in dry, 10 when wet. Third layer, more wool, but different. The outer layers were looser weave, sometimes mixed with animal hair, goat, reindeer, whatever was available. These layers trapped more air, creating additional insulation. The loose weave also allowed moisture to escape. Sweat vapor could pass through while cold air stayed out. Fourth layer, fur.
Not decorative fur, not status symbol fur. Working fur. Bear, wolf, seal, reindeer. Fur worn hairside in for maximum warmth or hairside out for wind resistance. Fur cloaks that wrapped the entire body. Fur hoods that protected the head and neck, where humans lose tremendous amounts of heat. Fifth layer, hide and leather. Sealskin boots, leather gloves lined with wool.
hide vests worn over the fur. These outer layers were wind-breaking, water-shedding shells that protected everything underneath. The complete system might involve 7 or 8 distinct pieces of clothing. Total weight, 20 to 30 pounds. It was armor against cold, built from biological materials, assembled through techniques perfected over centuries. And it worked. Archaeologists excavating Norse sites in Greenland have found bodies still wearing this layered system. The preservation is remarkable. The Arctic cold that killed them also preserved their clothing. We can see exactly what they wore. We can analyze the materials, the stitching, the construction. What we see is engineering. Every seam was placed deliberately. Sleeves were sewn tight at the wrists to prevent wind from entering. Hoods were designed to protect the face while allowing vision. Boots were constructed with the hair side in, creating an insulating layer around the foot. Nothing was decorative. Everything was functional. Because these people understood that clothing wasn't fashion. Clothing was survival technology. And getting it wrong meant death. The dead woman wore 7 layers. Archaeologists found her in 1904, buried in the Oseberg ship, a Viking vessel interred in blue clay near the Oslo fjord. The clay had sealed out oxygen for over 1,000 years. Wood remained intact, fabric survived. And there, in the burial chamber, lay a woman dressed for eternity, or dressed for winter. Same thing in Norse thinking. The innermost layer was linen, fine woven, almost translucent, pressed directly against what remained of her skin. Over that, a wool shift, the weave tight enough to trap air but loose enough to breathe. Then a heavier wool dress, dyed deep red with mather root. Over the dress, a wool apron pinned with bronze brooches. Over everything, a cloak, thick wool lined with strips of fur. On her feet, leather shoes stuffed with dried grass. On her hands, wool mittens with leather palms. Around her neck, a wool scarf wrapped 3 times, the ends tucked into her dress to seal the gap. She'd been dead for 11 centuries when they found her. Her clothing system was more sophisticated than anything medieval Europe would produce for another 500 years. This wasn't primitive gear, this was calculated engineering. Each layer chosen for specific thermal properties, each material selected for how it interacted with the layers above and below. The Vikings didn't just pile on clothes and hope for warmth. They understood insulation the way modern mountaineers understand it. They understood it because their lives depended on it. Wool was everything. Not all wool. The Vikings were particular. Sheep bred in Iceland and northern Norway produced wool with a double coat. The outer fibers were long and coarse, designed to shed water. The inner fibers were short and fine, designed to trap heat. This dual-layer wool, called tog, was the foundation of Norse cold weather survival. Modern outdoor companies still use Icelandic sheep wool. They market it as cutting-edge technology. The Vikings were wearing it 1,000 years ago. The preparation process was intense. Shearing happened in spring. The wool was washed in cold water. Hot water would felt it prematurely, reducing its insulating properties. Then came carding, the process of aligning fibers with wooden paddles studded with teasel heads or metal pins. Carding could take days for a single fleece. An adult's winter clothing required thousands of meters of thread. The thread went to weavers. Viking looms were vertical, weighted looms where threads hung under tension from a horizontal bar. The weaver stood, working for hours, building fabric row by row. A single wool tunic might represent 40 hours of weaving. A cloak, double that. A sail for a longship could take months.
But the Vikings didn't just weave flat fabric. They controlled the weave structure. Tight weaves for inner layers that needed to trap air. Loose weaves for outer layers that needed to breathe. Diagonal weaves called twill that created flexible, durable fabric resistant to tearing. Every textile was purpose-built. And then came the finishing process, fulling. Fulling is controlled felting. The woven wool gets pounded in water, sometimes with feet,
sometimes with wooden clubs, until the fibers lock together. The fabric shrinks, tightens, becomes nearly windproof. It's back-breaking labor. It's also what made Norse wool functional in Arctic conditions. A fulled wool cloak could stop wind that would cut through modern fleece like it wasn't there. But wool alone wasn't enough. The Vikings combined materials the way modern engineers combine metals in an alloy. Each substance brought specific properties. Together, they created something greater than the sum of parts. Fur provided insulation wool couldn't match. Bear fur, thick, dense, heavy, was prized for sleeping gear and extreme cold. The hairs trapped air more efficiently than any textile. A bearskin cloak could keep a man warm in conditions that would kill him in wool alone. Wolf fur was lighter, more flexible, better for active wear. Vikings used it for hood linings and glove interiors, places where mobility mattered. Reindeer fur was the miracle material. The hairs are hollow and segmented like tiny air-filled tubes. Reindeer hide is so insulating that Arctic people still use it. The Vikings harvested it from Sami traders and incorporated it into their most critical gear. Sealskin solved a different problem: water. Sealskin is naturally waterproof. The Vikings used it for boots, mittens, and outer shells on long voyages. A man could stand in freezing spray for hours, and as long as his sealskin boots held, his feet stayed dry. Dry meant warm. Wet meant dead. The stitching mattered too. Norse seamstresses, and this was skilled labor, not simple sewing, used sinew thread for waterproof seams. Sinew swells when wet, sealing the holes made by the needle. They placed seams away from areas of high stress and water exposure. They treated finished seams with beeswax for additional waterproofing. Every detail was deliberate. Because these people lived in an environment where a single mistake in clothing construction could kill you 6 weeks into a voyage, when your boots split and seawater got in and your feet froze and gangrene set in, and there was no doctor, no hospital, no rescue. Just you, your gear, and the colt. Get your gear right, you lived. Get it wrong, you died. The Vikings got it right. The morning ritual was sacred. Before launch, before the ship left harbor, every man performed the same sequence. It wasn't religious, exactly. More like a soldier checking weapons before battle. Your clothing was your primary defense. You checked it, you confirmed it, you trusted nothing. Start with the linen undergarment. Feel for damp spots, any moisture left from yesterday's sweat. If damp, change it. Damp linen against skin meant heat loss. Heat loss meant hypothermia. Hypothermia meant death. Simple equation. Next, the inner wool layer. Check for tears, especially at the seams under the arms and in the crotch, places where friction and movement caused wear. A torn seam meant wind entry. Wind meant cold penetration. Cold meant your insulation system failed. Inspect the stitching on the wrists and ankles. These areas had to be tight. Wind entering at the extremities could circulate up inside your clothing, destroying the warm air pocket your body heat had created. The Vikings understood convection better than they understood the word for it. The outer wool layer came next. Feel the fabric. If it's stiff with salt from dried spray, it needs replacing. Salt draws moisture. Moisture reduces insulation. Every wool layer had a backup stowed in the sea chest, not a luxury, a survival necessity. Now the fur cloak.
Shake it out. Check for ice buildup in the fur itself. Ice forms from frozen breath and body moisture. It adds weight and reduces insulation. The Vikings would beat ice from fur with wooden paddles, breaking it loose without damaging the hide. Boots last. The most critical piece. Your feet were your foundation.
Lose your feet to frostbite and you couldn't work, couldn't walk, became dead weight on a ship where every man needed to pull his share. Sealskin boots packed with dried grass. The grass acted as insulation and wicking material, drawing moisture away from the foot. Soggy grass meant replacing it. Crews carried bags of dried grass as standard equipment. Changed the grass twice daily on long voyages. No exceptions. The boots tied at the knee with leather straps, tight enough to keep water out, loose enough to allow circulation. Too tight meant restricted blood flow. Restricted blood flow meant cold feet. Cold feet meant frostbite. The entire dressing ritual took 20 minutes. 20 minutes that might save your life 6 days later when the storm hit and the temperature dropped and the spray turned to ice on the rigging, and the only thing between you and death was the gear you'd checked that morning in harbor. So you checked. Every man, every voyage, every time. The Norse didn't think of clothing as protection from cold. They thought of it as captured warmth. This distinction mattered. Protection implies defense, a passive shield against external threat. The Vikings approached cold weather clothing differently. They weren't blocking cold, they were trapping heat. Their cosmology reflected this. In Norse mythology, creation began with ice and fire. The frozen realm of Niflheim met the burning realm of Muspelheim. Where they touched, life emerged, heat and cold in balance. Too much of either meant death. The proper mixture meant survival. Humans existed in that narrow band between extremes. The gods gave humans fire, Loki's gift, dangerous and necessary. But fire was for the land, for the hall, for the hearth. At sea, humans had to create their own warmth. The gods didn't provide it. Humans generated it through their own bodies, then preserved it through craft and cunning. A man's clothing was his personal hearth. This wasn't metaphor. The Vikings measured clothing effectiveness by how well it retained body heat. Modern thermodynamics confirms their intuition. The human body at rest produces about 100 watts of heat. Active labor increases that to 300 to 400 watts. That's a small space heater worth of energy. The trick was keeping that energy close to the body instead of letting it radiate into the air. Every layer of wool, every strip of fur, every sealed seam was a trap for warmth. The Vikings built cages of fabric and hide that held their own heat in. And because they couldn't use fire to generate external heat, they became experts at maximizing internal heat production. Diet was part of this, we'll get there. So was physical activity. So was communal sleeping arrangements. The Vikings developed an entire system around the reality that the human body was their only furnace. They fed that furnace carefully, they insulated it expertly, and they never ever let the fire inside go out. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming. Sites across the Viking world, from Norway to Iceland to Greenland to Newfoundland, show the same pattern. Massive amounts of textile production. Every household had looms, every woman was a weaver, every man knew how to maintain his gear. The Lance Meadows site in Newfoundland, the only confirmed Viking settlement in North America, shows evidence of spinning and weaving despite being occupied for maybe 3 years. The Vikings didn't travel without textile production capability. They needed to make and repair clothing constantly, because clothing wore out. The friction of work, the corrosion of salt water, the freeze-thaw cycles, these destroyed fabric faster than modern materials fail. A wool tunic might last 1 season of hard use before needing replacement. A cloak, maybe 2 seasons. Mittens wore through at the palms in weeks. So they made more.
Constant production, always spinning, always weaving, always sewing. The women left behind when the men sailed spent months preparing clothing for the next voyage. It wasn't hobby craft, it was survival logistics. The Greenland settlements collapsed in the 14th century. Historians still debate why. Climate change played a role, but some researchers point to textile production breakdown. As the climate cooled, growing conditions worsened. Sheep populations declined. Wool production dropped. Without wool, the colonists couldn't maintain their insulation systems. And without insulation, they died. The final generation of Greenlanders left bodies dressed in patched, repatched, desperately maintained clothing. Garments that had been repaired so many times they were more patches than original fabric. These people knew that clothing meant survival. They clung to their wool systems even as everything else failed. It wasn't enough. The cold won. What for 3 centuries before that, the cold lost. The Vikings mastered it through nothing more than sheep, skill, and the knowledge that warmth wasn't something you borrowed from fire. Warmth was something you built, layer by layer, thread by thread, with your own hands. Each man wore his own hearth upon his skin. That image, that understanding, defined Viking seafaring more than any dragon prow or battle axe. The weapons got the attention. The clothing kept them alive. Without fire, they became fire. Without heat, they created heat. Without external warmth, they turned inward, learning to recognize and preserve the warmth their own bodies produced. They became experts at reading their own thermal state, recognizing the early signs of heat loss, knowing when to add a layer, when to increase activity, when to seek shelter. This knowledge was passed down like navigation techniques or shipbuilding skills. Fathers taught sons, mothers taught daughters. Stay dry, layer properly, check your seams, replace your grass, trust your gear, but verify constantly. The Vikings who survived weren't lucky, they were prepared. And preparation started with one fundamental truth. In the frozen north, clothing wasn't fashion or status or decoration. Clothing was technology, life support technology. And like any technology, it only worked if you understood the principles, maintained the system, and never, ever took it for granted. Because the cold was always waiting, always patient, always ready to kill you the moment your guard dropped. The Vikings never dropped their guard. 2 men, 1 bag. The hood fought, literally hide bed, was the Vikings' darkest secret and their greatest advantage. You won't see it in movies. It doesn't fit the lone warrior narrative. But it's there in the archaeological record, undeniable and strange. Animal hides sewn into a large envelope, big enough for 2 grown men, fur on the inside, leather on the outside, opening at the top that could be pulled tight with leather straps. They slept in pairs, not sometimes, not casually, by design, by necessity, by a system so fundamental to Viking seafaring that it appears in burial goods, legal codes, and saga references. The pairing wasn't random. Before every voyage, the ship's captain assigned sleeping partners. These assignments were recorded, witnessed, treated as seriously as watch assignments or oar positions. Your sleeping partner was your survival partner. You depended on him completely. He depended on you. Because alone in the Arctic night, you died. Together, you lived. The physics were brutal. Human body temperature 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Ambient temperature on a North Atlantic voyage in winter, often below 0. A single human body trying to maintain that differential will fail. The body sheds heat faster than it can produce it. Core temperature drops, hypothermia sets in, death follows. 2 bodies, though, change the equation. 2 bodies in close contact share heat. The thermal mass doubles. The surface area exposed to cold air increases only slightly. Net result, heat loss slows dramatically. What one body can't sustain alone, 2 bodies can maintain together. The hood fought amplified this effect. The hide envelope trapped air warmed by body heat. The fur inside created additional insulation. The leather outside blocked wind. 2 men inside generated roughly 200 watts of combined heat at rest, more if they'd been working hard before sleep. That heat stayed contained, warming the small space inside the bag. Modern survival experts teach the same technique. 2 people in one sleeping bag survive conditions that would kill them separately. The Vikings figured this out through trial, error, and countless frozen corpses. Then they systematized it.
The sleeping partners weren't chosen for friendship. Compatibility mattered, yes, you can't sleep next to someone you hate, but the primary criteria were practical. Body size, heat generation, experience level, health status. Large men produced more heat, but required more space. They paired with smaller men to balance the load. Young men, inexperienced and prone to panic, paired with veterans who could keep them calm during storms. Sick men, anyone showing signs of illness or injury, paired with the healthiest crew members to share warmth they couldn't generate alone. The captain rotated assignments throughout the voyage based on conditions. During calm weather, experienced men might pair together, allowing younger crew to build confidence with their own partners. During storms or extreme cold, the captain redistributed, putting the most vulnerable men with the strongest, ensuring no one failed. It was logistics, cold weather warfare against an environment that wanted them dead. And like all good military systems, it depended on discipline. The rules were explicit. Both men entered the huddled before sleep, no exceptions. Entering a sleeping bag after your partner was already warm meant introducing a cold body into a warm space. The cold body would leach heat from the warm one, potentially cooling both below safe levels. Both men stayed in the bag until morning watch. Leaving early disrupted your partner's sleep and vented the accumulated heat. Unless emergency required it, you stayed put. Body position mattered. The men lay side by side, not facing. Facing meant breathing directly on your partner's face, uncomfortable and likely to cause conflict. Side by side meant sharing heat efficiently without forced intimacy. Arms and legs stayed inside the bag. Extremities stuck outside lost heat rapidly and cooled the whole system. If your foot was cold, you dealt with it. You didn't stick it outside and freeze everyone. No wet clothing inside the bag. Water conducts heat 25 times faster than air. A wet tunic inside the huddled would drain warmth catastrophically. Strip down to dry inner layers before entering. Wet outer gear hung on the rigging to freeze dry overnight. These rules weren't suggestions, they were law, enforced by the captain, backed by the crew, violated at lethal risk. The sleeping arrangements told you everything about Viking society. This wasn't a culture of radical individualism. This was a collective survival culture where your life depended on the man next to you and his life depended on you. The solo hero mythology doesn't fit the archaeological reality. Vikings survived through cooperation. The sleeping covenant was the clearest example. You couldn't survive alone. You needed your partner. He needed you. Trust wasn't optional. It was structural. Break trust, and people died. The sagas reflect this. In the saga of Eric the Red, there's a scene where 2 crew members have a bitter dispute. The ship's captain doesn't mediate. He doesn't care who's right. He separates them, reassigns sleeping partners, and tells them both that if their conflict threatens crew cohesion, they'll be put ashore at the next landing. Because individual grievances couldn't override collective survival. Another saga, the saga of the Greenlanders, describes a voyage where one man refuses to share his sleeping bag properly, hogging space and disrupting his partner's rest. The crew votes him out at the next port. Doesn't matter that he was a skilled oarsman. Doesn't matter that they were short-handed. Bad sleeping partner meant threat to everyone. He stayed behind. The Vikings didn't tolerate weakness in their survival systems. Nighttime aboard a longship was its own world. The ship never fully stopped. Even anchored in a sheltered fjord, the vessel moved, rocking with swells, groaning as wood flexed, ropes creaking in the wind. On open water, the motion was constant and violent. Sleeping in that environment required adaptation. The hudfoot bags were placed along the center of the ship, between the rowing benches. This was the most stable area, closest to the keel, least affected by roll and pitch. The bags were tied down with leather straps to prevent sliding. The men slept in shifts.
Half the crew rested, while the other half maintained watch. Watches rotated every 4 hours. Longer than that, and fatigue became dangerous. Shorter, and no one got deep sleep. Watch duty meant staying awake in conditions designed to induce unconsciousness. Freezing cold, darkness, the hypnotic rock of waves. No fire for light or warmth. Just you, your wool layers, and the absolute necessity of staying alert. Failure meant death. Not abstract death, immediate, concrete death. A sleeping watch might miss a change in wind direction, allowing the sail to backwind and snap the mast. Might miss the sound of breakers ahead, driving the ship onto rocks. Might miss the approach of another vessel looking to raid. So the watch stayed awake. They walked the deck. They sang, quietly, but sang, keeping themselves alert. They checked rigging by touch in darkness too complete for vision. They monitored the sleeping crew, listening for sounds of distress. And they were cold. Colder than the sleeping men in the hudfat bags. The walking, working watchmen burned calories to generate heat, but they also faced wind chill without the insulation of the sleeping bags. They wore extra layers. They moved constantly. They ate fatty rations to fuel their internal furnaces. 4 hours of watch duty in winter conditions could leave a man shivering so hard his teeth cracked. Then his turn ended. He stripped off wet outer layers, crawled into the hudfat with his sleeping partner, and felt the shock of warmth that meant survival for another night. The sounds were distinctive. Anyone who spent time on a boat knows the acoustic environment is unique. Every creak, every groan, every slap of water against the hull is amplified. Add 30 men sleeping in hide bags, and the soundscape became something between a barracks and a cattle barn. Snoring, constant, from multiple sources, in shifting rhythms. Some men snored quietly. Some snored like avalanches. You learned to sleep through it, or you didn't sleep. Breathing, the heavy, rhythmic respiration of exhausted men deep in sleep. After 12 hours of rowing, men didn't just sleep, they collapsed into unconsciousness so complete that their breathing slowed to barely detectable levels. Movement, the rustle of hide and fur as men shifted position, the creak of leather straps, the occasional thud of someone rolled against their partner. Coughing, inevitable on long voyages. Salt spray irritated lungs. Cold air triggered bronchial spasms. Men coughed, tried to muffle it, failed, woke their partners, apologized in whispers, went back to sleep. And underneath everything, the ship's voice. The constant, multi-layered sound of a wooden vessel under stress. The hull flexing with each wave, the mast creaking, the rigging singing in the wind, the slap, slap, slap of water along the strakes. The Vikings learned to hear the ship the way a mother hears her child, sensitive to any change in tone that might signal danger. A change in the creaking pattern meant the wind had shifted. A change in the water sounds meant the current had altered. A change in the overall acoustic environment meant weather moving in. The experienced men could diagnose ship conditions from sound alone, even in their sleep. They'd wake instantly if something sounded wrong, ready to respond before the watch called alarm, because the ship was alive to them. Not metaphorically, literally. Alive in their cosmology. The Vikings named their ships, spoke to them, performed rituals to keep them healthy. They believed ships had spirits, that the wood remembered being a tree, that the vessel had consciousness and will. Modern people might call that superstition, but consider,
If you believe your ship is alive and watching over you, you treat it differently. You maintain it better. You notice problems earlier. You develop a relationship with the vessel that makes you more sensitive to changes in its behavior. The Vikings who survived were the ones who listened when their ships spoke. The sail became their tent. During storms or extreme cold, the crew would lower the massive wool sail and suspend it over the rowing benches, creating a roof. The sail blocked wind and trapped heat from the sleeping crew below. This transformation was practiced, almost ritualized.
When the captain called for shelter configuration, everyone knew their role. The sail came down, a controlled descent requiring coordination to prevent tearing. The men secured the bottom edge to the gunwales with leather lines. They propped the center up with oars to create headroom. Inside this fabric cave, conditions improved dramatically. The wind stopped. Body heat from 30 men accumulated in the enclosed space. The temperature inside might rise 20 or 30 degrees compared to outside. Still cold, still well below freezing, but survivable. The sail tent became their temporary world. Men cooked cold rations, pre-cooked before the voyage, safe to eat without reheating. They performed maintenance, stitching torn clothing, re-waterproofing boots, splicing rope. They told stories, the oral tradition that preserved Norse history. They sang, voices carrying through wool into the night. And they slept. Inside the sail tent, inside the hudfat bags, paired men shared warmth in darkness. The intimacy was profound, not sexual, but absolute. You heard your partner's heartbeat, you felt his breathing. You knew by the tension in his body whether he was truly asleep or just pretending. You learned to trust completely. Because if your partner panics during a storm, if he thrashed or tried to leave the bag at the wrong moment, he could kill you both. If he was sick and didn't tell you, you'd catch it. If he gave up, if he lost the will to survive, his death spiral could drag you down too. So you chose your partners carefully. You built relationships over multiple voyages. You learned each other's patterns, moods, limits. The sleeping covenant wasn't just about heat sharing. It was about psychological survival in an environment designed to break human minds. The darkness, the cold, the constant danger, the weeks without seeing land, the knowledge that one mistake meant death for everyone. Men survived that by not being alone. They didn't fight the cold alone. They fought it together. That sentence defines Viking seafaring more than any romantic image of individual warriors conquering nature through sheer will. Will mattered, yes, but structure mattered more. Systems mattered more. The recognition that humans are tropical animals surviving in Arctic conditions through cooperation mattered most. The hudfat wasn't just a sleeping bag. It was a social technology, a system that acknowledged human vulnerability and converted it into strength through partnership. 2 weak humans became one strong unit. 30 men became an organism that could survive what no individual could endure. Modern militaries understand this. Special forces train in pairs. Swim buddies, shooting partners, men who learn to function as a single unit. The Vikings figured it out 1,000 years earlier. They had to, because the alternative was death, frozen, alone, in the dark. The butter was rancid. 3 weeks old, stored in a sealed leather pouch, it had gone from yellow to gray-brown. The smell hit you like a fist, sharp, acidic, wrong. A modern person would throw it out immediately, wouldn't consider eating it. The Viking ate it anyway. He scooped a fingerful from the pouch, mixed it into cold barley porridge, and chewed slowly. His face showed nothing, no disgust, no hesitation. This was fuel. Fuel didn't need to taste good, it needed to keep you alive. And butter, even rancid butter, was concentrated energy. 1 tablespoon, 100 calories. Pure fat. The kind of caloric density that kept a man's internal furnace burning when external temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for weeks.
The Vikings understood something modern nutritionists would rediscover centuries later. Cold is expensive. Thermogenesis, the body's heat production, burns calories at accelerating rates as ambient temperature drops. A man sitting still in a warm room uses about 1,800 calories per day. The same man sitting still in freezing conditions uses 2,500. Add physical labor, rowing, sail management, cargo handling, and the number climbs to 4,000 or more. 4,000 calories per day. That's Olympic athlete levels. That's Tour de France cyclist levels, sustained for weeks, without fire for cooking. The Vikings solved this problem through preparation, preservation, and sheer caloric brutality.
The voyage provisions were packed weeks before departure. This wasn't improvised. This was logistics on a scale most medieval societies couldn't manage. A 30-man crew on a 3-week voyage needed 2.5 million calories. That's over a ton of food, a literal ton packed into a vessel barely 60 feet long. Storage was critical. Everything went into leather sacks, wooden barrels, or ceramic pots, containers that could survive salt spray, temperature swings, and constant jostling. The containers were sealed with beeswax or pine tar. Nothing could be allowed to get wet. Wet food spoiled. Spoiled food meant starvation. The core staples were chosen for calorie density and preservation capability. Dried fish, specifically cod, air-dried until it became hard as wood. The Vikings hung fish on racks in the cold Arctic air, letting natural freeze-drying preserve it for months. Dried cod lost 80% of its weight, but retained all its protein and most of its calories. A 10-pound fish became 2 pounds of storage-stable protein that could last a year. Eating it was an ordeal. Dried cod was so hard you couldn't bite through it. The Vikings soaked it in water overnight to rehydrate it, or they pounded it with stones to break down the fibers. Some men just chewed it dry, working a piece in their mouth for an hour until it softened enough to swallow. It tasted like salted leather. It kept you alive. Salted meat came next: pork, mutton, sometimes seal or whale. The meat was packed in salt, massive amounts of salt, until it was essentially mummified. The salt drew out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't grow. The salt also made you desperately thirsty. The Vikings countered this with beer. Not modern beer. Viking beer was thick, nutritious, almost a liquid bread. Low alcohol content, high calorie count, made from barley and whatever grains were available. It was safer than water, which could carry disease, and it provided calories beyond simple hydration. A man might drink 2 liters of beer per day. That's 600, 800 calories right there, before solid food. Then came the butter. Glorious, hideous, essential butter. Stored in leather pouches, in ceramic pots, in sealed wooden containers. It went rancid quickly. There was no refrigeration, no way to keep it fresh. The Vikings didn't care. Rancid butter was still fat, still calories, still fuel. They mixed it into porridge, spread it on hard bread, ate it straight when conditions were desperate. A man could consume half a pound of butter per day, 1,600 calories of pure fat. His arteries probably hated him. His core temperature thanked him. The meals had no warmth. This reality separated Viking seafaring from every other maritime culture. Roman sailors cooked on board using brick stoves. Chinese junks had galley fires. Even later European vessels used sandboxes to contain cooking flames. The Vikings ate cold food. Every meal. Every day. For weeks. Breakfast was porridge. Barley or oats mixed with water or beer the night before, left to soften overnight. By morning, it was edible. Barely. Men added butter, honey if they had it, dried berries. They ate it with wooden spoons from wooden bowls. It was gray. It was lumpy. It was cold.
It was 800 calories. Lunch was dried fish and hard bread. The bread, dense, unleavened, baked before the voyage, could crack teeth. Some men soaked it in beer to soften it. Others just gnawed until their jaws ached. Dinner was more of the same. Salted meat if they were lucky, dried peas or beans that had been soaking all day in leather pouches, more porridge, more butter, more beer. Variety was minimal. After a week at sea, you'd eaten the same meal 14 times. After 2 weeks, 28 times. The monotony was crushing. Food became mechanical, fuel intake divorced from pleasure. But the calorie count was carefully managed. The Vikings knew, through centuries of trial and error, exactly how much food a man needed to survive cold weather sailing. They knew active rowers needed more than men on light duty. They knew watchkeepers needed extra rations to compensate for exposure. They knew sick men needed different nutrition than healthy ones. The ship's captain controlled food distribution, not the cook. There was no cook. The captain rationed supplies based on conditions, crew status, and remaining voyage length. Run out of food 3 days from land? Everyone died. Rationed too strictly, and men became too weak to work. It was mathematics. Cold equations where getting the numbers wrong meant death.
The whale fat was a gift from the gods. When the Vikings could acquire it, through trade with northern peoples or their own hunting, whale blubber became the ultimate survival food. Pure fat, 9 calories per gram, the highest caloric density of any natural food. A fist-sized chunk of whale blubber contained over 1,000 calories. Eating it was an act of will. The texture was rubbery, waxy, like chewing solidified oil. The taste was fishy, overwhelming, pervasive. It coated your mouth, your throat, your stomach. Some men vomited the first time they tried it. But it worked. The Vikings would cut blubber into small cubes and eat it throughout the day, a piece every few hours, maintaining a constant influx of calories. The fat metabolized slowly, providing sustained energy. More importantly, it provided the raw material for thermogenesis. The body burns fat to generate heat. Give the body abundant fat, and it becomes a furnace. Men who ate whale blubber regularly could tolerate cold that would disable others. Their core temperatures stayed stable. Their extremities stayed functional. They didn't shiver as violently or as often. The downside was gastric distress. That much fat caused digestive chaos, stomach cramps, diarrhea, nausea. The Vikings accepted this as the price of survival. Better to be warm with an upset stomach than cold with a comfortable one. They called it sea medicine. Not medicine in the healing sense, medicine in the surviving sense, the thing you consumed not because you wanted to, but because the alternative was death. The Vikings understood inner fire. This concept appears throughout Norse mythology and wasn't purely metaphorical. The Vikings recognized that the human body generates heat through metabolism. They didn't have the scientific vocabulary, they didn't know about mitochondria or cellular respiration, but they understood the principle. Food became heat. More food became more heat. Specific foods, fats especially, became more heat than others. So they structured their diet around maximum heat generation. They prioritized fats over carbohydrates when possible. They recognized that butter, whale blubber, and fatty meats kept them warmer than bread and vegetables alone. This wasn't random. This was observation codified into survival strategy. Watch a man eat nothing but dried fish and hard bread. Track how quickly he gets cold, how soon he starts shivering, how his work capacity drops. Now watch a man eat dried fish plus half a pound of butter. He stays warm longer, works harder, survives better. The Vikings noticed. They adjusted. They optimized. Modern science explains why. Thermogenesis requires substrates. The body needs raw materials to burn. Protein provides some thermogenesis through digestion, the so-called thermic effect of food. Carbohydrates provide quick energy but burn fast. Fat provides sustained high-output fuel that keeps internal heat generation running for hours.
The Vikings figured this out through empirical observation. They didn't need laboratories. They had the North Atlantic as testing ground. The men who got the diet right survived. The men who didn't died. Over generations, the survivors passed down their knowledge. Eat fat, eat constantly, eat until you're uncomfortably full. Your life depends on calories. The food rituals mattered as much as the food itself. Meals weren't just fuel intake. They were social events, psychological anchors in an environment designed to break human minds. The crew ate together, everyone at once when the captain called mealtime. No one ate alone, no one ate early, no one hoarded rations. The communal nature was enforced strictly because individual behavior could threaten collective survival. One man hoarding food meant one man with extra energy and 29 with deficits. That imbalance could kill everyone if the hoarder couldn't pull his weight when a storm hit. So they ate together, sitting on rowing benches, bowls and laps, sharing from common containers. The act of eating together reinforced crew cohesion. You watched other men eat the same terrible food you were eating. You heard them complain. You shared in the misery. Misery shared is misery reduced.
The Vikings knew this instinctively. They built community through shared hardship. Meals were a daily reminder. We're all suffering. We're all surviving. We're all in this together. The portions were equal, strictly equal. The captain might allocate more food to men doing heavy labor, but within duty categories, everyone got the same amount. No favorites, no special treatment. This prevented conflict. Hunger makes men violent. Hunger combined with perceived unfairness makes men mutinous. The Vikings eliminated the unfairness variable. Everyone suffered equally. Therefore, no one had grounds to complain. If you were hungry and everyone was always hungry, at least you knew your shipmate was exactly as hungry. That knowledge prevented the kind of resentment that could fracture a crew. The mythology reflected the reality. In Norse cosmology, Loki wasn't purely evil. He was chaos, yes, dangerous, unpredictable, destructive. But he was also fire. And fire was energy, the force that drove change, that made things happen. The Vikings saw Loki in themselves. They carried fire internally, not literal flame, that was forbidden at sea, but metabolic fire, the burning of calories that kept their bodies functioning in impossible conditions. They were walking, breathing incarnations of Loki's principle: consume, burn, survive through controlled destruction. This wasn't blasphemy. This was understanding their place in the cosmic order. The gods had their realm, humans had theirs. At sea, humans couldn't rely on divine intervention. They relied on their own bodies, properly fueled, properly maintained. The fire within was their prayer. Some sagas describe warriors burning with inner strength before battle. Modern readers interpret this as metaphor, battle rage, adrenaline, psychological intensity. But there may be literal truth embedded in the poetry. A Viking warrior properly fed, 4,000 calories per day of high-fat, high-protein diet, would have significantly elevated metabolic rate. His body would literally generate more heat than an underfed opponent. He'd be stronger, faster, more enduring. The burning might not be metaphor at all. It might be the Vikings recognizing that well-fed warriors had a physical advantage, an internal fire that translated to combat effectiveness. Feed the body, fuel the fire, become unstoppable. The supplies ran out eventually. Even the most carefully rationed provisions hit zero. 3-week voyages occasionally became 4-week ordeals when storms blew ships off course or calms left them becalmed. When the food ran out, starvation began. The Vikings had protocols for this too. First, fishing. Longships weren't fishing vessels, but every crew carried lines and hooks. When provisions ran low, men fished. The catch was minimal. Fishing from a moving vessel with simple tackle rarely produced much. But even a few fish per day extended survival time. Second,
emergency reserves. The captain held back a hidden cache of the highest calorie foods: butter, dried meat, honey. This reserve was for absolute emergencies only. Revealing its existence too early could trigger demands to distribute it. Revealing it too late meant men too weak to benefit. Timing was everything. Third, belt tightening. Literally. The Vikings wore belts, and when rations dropped, they tightened them. The pressure on the abdomen reduced hunger pangs slightly and reminded you that discipline was the only thing standing between survival and death. Fourth, resignation. If food ran out completely and land wasn't in sight, the crew knew they were dead. Some sagas describe crews in this situation maintaining discipline to the end, rowing in shifts, keeping watches, treating the inevitable with quiet dignity. Others describe chaos, fighting over scraps, cannibalism accusations, mutiny against captains who miscalculated provisions. The difference between those outcomes was leadership and culture. Good captains with cohesive crews could maintain order even in starvation. Poor captains with fractured crews descended into savagery. The Vikings who survived to tell tales belonged to the first category.
Their fire was inside them. That's the revelation at the heart of Viking food culture. They couldn't carry external fire. Too dangerous. So they internalized it. They turned their bodies into furnaces through sheer caloric intake and accepted the consequences. The consequences were significant. Dental problems from chewing hard foods, digestive issues from rancid fats, vitamin deficiencies from monotonous diets, scurvy on long voyages when fresh foods ran out. The Vikings suffered these problems routinely, but they survived. And survival was the only metric that mattered. Modern people focus on food quality, taste, texture, variety, freshness. The Vikings focused on food function. Does it provide calories? Does it preserve well? Can we carry enough? Will it keep us alive? Everything else was luxury. There was no luxury at sea. Just cold equations, brutal math, the recognition that human bodies are machines requiring fuel, and in the frozen north, that fuel needs to be abundant, dense, and consumed without hesitation, even when it tastes like death, even when it makes you sick, even when every fiber of your being rebels against putting another spoonful of rancid butter into your mouth, you eat it anyway. Because the alternative is freezing to death while your shipmates watch, unable to help because they need their calories to save themselves. The Vikings understood this completely, and they ate. The fire was visible from 2 miles out. A column of smoke rising from the rocky beach, gray against gray sky. The crew saw it and felt something primal shift in their chests. Relief so profound it bordered on religious experience. Fire, real fire, external heat they could walk toward, sit beside, let warm their frozen bodies from the outside in. 3 weeks without it. 3 weeks of internal burning, of calories converted to warmth, of wool layers and sleeping bags, and the constant grinding effort of staying alive through sheer metabolic will. Now, flame. The longship altered course toward the beacon. Oars dipped faster, men finding energy reserves they'd thought depleted. The beach wasn't random. This was a way station, a calculated stop on a route the Vikings had refined over centuries. They hadn't survived the frozen seas through endurance alone. They'd survived through infrastructure. The Viking world was networked. Not accidentally, not casually. The Norse created a maritime civilization that stretched from Newfoundland to Baghdad, and they did it by building a chain of safe harbors, supply stations, and winter camps across every major route they sailed. These weren't cities, weren't even permanent settlements in many cases. They were functional bases,
Places with fires, with roofs, with food stores and repair facilities. Places where frozen men could recover before the next leg of their journey. The sites were chosen carefully. Protected harbors, fresh water access, defensible positions, fuel sources, driftwood, peat, anything that could burn. The Vikings mapped these locations obsessively, passing knowledge through oral tradition and practical apprenticeship. Every experienced navigator knew the stopping points. 20 miles to the first camp, 40 miles to the second, 70 miles to the third. The distances were calculated based on realistic sailing speeds and crew endurance. No leg was so long that a ship couldn't reach shelter before conditions became lethal. This network was their lifeline. Without it, Norse expansion would have been impossible. You can't colonize Iceland or Greenland through sheer toughness. You need logistics, you need bases, you need the ability to break impossible journeys into manageable segments. The Vikings built that system deliberately, and they maintained it ruthlessly.
The beach camp was basic but functional. Stone-ringed fire pits, blackened from repeated use, wooden racks for drying fish or meat, rough shelters, turf walls, driftwood frames, sealskin roofs. Nothing permanent, nothing elaborate, just enough to keep men alive during stops that might last a day or a week depending on weather. The fire was already burning when they arrived. Not magic. Other crews maintained these camps. You used what you needed, you restocked what you could, you left it better than you found it. Mutual aid wasn't altruism, it was survival insurance. The camp you maintain today might save your life tomorrow. The Vikings understood collective action better than most modern societies. They had to. Individual success meant nothing if the system failed. A man who hoarded resources, or damaged camps, or took more than his share might survive that voyage, but word would spread. Next time, other crews wouldn't help him. His selfishness would be remembered. In a world where survival depended on cooperation, reputation was currency. So camps were maintained, fire pits cleaned, wood stacks replenished, shelters repaired. Not because anyone enforced it, there was no central authority, because everyone understood that the system only worked if everyone participated. Tragedy of the commons, prevented through cultural cohesion. The crew stumbled ashore like drunks. 3 weeks on a rocking ship left men with strange gaits. The sea legs that made dry land feel wrong. They staggered to the fire, hands outstretched, faces blank with exhaustion. The warmth hit them physically. Not gentle warmth, aggressive heat that made frozen skin prickle and ache. Their faces flushed, their hands, numb for weeks, started to feel again. And feeling meant pain. Thawing hurts. Blood returning to constricted vessels hurts. Men groaned, cursed, held their hands as close to flame as they could stand. No one spoke much. They just sat, absorbing heat like plants absorbing sun, letting the fire do what their bodies had been doing internally, generate warmth that kept tissue alive and functional. The fire gave them something precious: rest. For 3 weeks, their bodies had been furnaces running full blast. Every calorie converted to heat, every system pushed to maximum output just to maintain core temperature. It was exhausting in ways that went beyond physical fatigue. Now their bodies could relax, let external heat handle thermal regulation, redirect metabolic resources to recovery, repairing damaged tissue, processing accumulated waste, rebuilding depleted reserves. Men fell asleep sitting up, just slumped over and were gone, bodies seizing the opportunity to shut down non-essential functions while fire handled survival. The captain posted guards anyway. Even in safe harbors, vigilance mattered. But he let the rest rest. They'd earned it. They'd survived another crossing. The camps held supplies. Not much, these weren't warehouses, but every camp maintained basic stocks: dried fish in sealed containers, grain if the location supported agriculture, salt for preserving fresh catches, tools for ship repair, fabric for clothing maintenance. The supplies were communal property. Anyone could use them, but the unwritten rule was replacement.
Take a week's worth of fish, leave a week's worth if you could. Use a tool, sharpen it before returning it. Consume supplies, replenish them when possible. This system worked because failure meant death for everyone. If one crew stripped a camp without restocking, the next crew arrived to empty stores and potentially died. Word would spread. The first crew would find themselves unwelcome at every port, denied trading partnerships, excluded from joint ventures. In a small world, and the Viking maritime world was small, everyone knew everyone. Social pressure was enormous. You couldn't anonymously defect. Your reputation followed you. So, people cooperated. Not from goodness, from calculated self-interest in a society where cooperation was the only winning strategy. Game theory, practiced before the mathematics existed to describe it.
The work started after rest. Men woke from their fire-warmed stupor and began tasks they couldn't perform at sea. First, washing. Weeks of accumulated salt, sweat, and grime came off in cold, freshwater streams. The Vikings weren't obsessed with cleanliness, but salt residue caused skin breakdown and needed removal. They washed clothes, too. Stripped down, scrubbed wool in stream water, wrung it out, hung it on drying racks near the fire. Wet wool was useless at sea. Here, with fire to dry it, they could refresh their insulation systems. Next, ship repair. Every voyage caused damage. Planks loosened, caulking wore away, rigging frayed. The crew hauled the ship partially onto beach and performed maintenance impossible on water. They heated pine tar over the fire, the only time they used flame for ship-related work. Hot tar flowed into seams, sealing gaps that had opened during the voyage. They replaced worn rope sections. They repaired sail tears using needles and thread kept dry in waterproof pouches. This work was skilled labor. Not every man could do it, but every crew included experienced shipwrights who understood Norse clinker construction intimately. These men were valued as highly as navigators. Lose your shipwright, and your vessel would slowly degrade until it became unseaworthy. The repairs took days, sometimes a week if damage was extensive. The crew used the time to rest, hunt, fish, rebuild strength, because the next leg was coming. The camps weren't just practical, they were mythologically significant. In Norse cosmology, the world was divided between ordered civilization and chaotic wilderness. The sea was chaos, unpredictable, hostile, ruled by beings that wanted humans dead. Land was order. Land was where gods and men met. Land was where fire could burn without killing you. The camps represented transition points between these realms. Sacred, liminal spaces where Vikings shifted from chaos survival mode to civilized rest mode. They performed small rituals at these sites, offerings to sea spirits for safe passage, thanks to land spirits for shelter. Nothing elaborate. Vikings weren't intensely ritualistic, but a libation poured on the ground, a bit of food left at the fire, these gestures acknowledged forces beyond human control. Modern people might call this superstition, but consider the psychology. You've just survived conditions that should have killed you. You're about to go back out into those conditions. A small ritual that connects your survival to something larger than yourself, that provides psychological framework for processing fear and exhaustion, that's not irrational. That's adaptive. The Vikings who survived were the ones who found ways to manage psychological stress. Ritual was one tool. Community was another. Shared stories around fires were a third. They survived through practical means supported by psychological frameworks that kept minds intact when conditions wanted to break them. The network extended everywhere Vikings sailed. Iceland, dozens of camps around the coast, each positioned for one-day sailing stages. The first settlers used this network to explore and eventually colonize the entire island. Greenland, fewer camps, harsher conditions, but the same principle. Norse Greenlanders maintained way stations along the coast, making journeys possible that would otherwise be suicidal.
Newfoundland. Lonza Meadows shows evidence of Norse habitation, a base for exploring farther into North America. It didn't last, but while it existed, it was part of the network. Britain and Ireland. Raiding camps that became trading posts that became settlements. The Vikings established positions across coastlines, creating infrastructure for repeated visits. Russian river routes. Camps along the Volga and Dnieper, supporting trade expeditions into the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Norse traders could travel thousands of miles because they knew where to stop, where to resupply, where to find safety. The scope was staggering. This wasn't random expansion. This was systematic colonization supported by logistical infrastructure that rivaled anything the Roman Empire had achieved centuries earlier. And it was all built around one principle. Humans can't survive the frozen seas through endurance alone. They need bases. They need fire. They need places where the battle against cold can pause. The Vikings built those places everywhere they went.
The camps were ahead of their time. Medieval Europe had nothing comparable. Trade routes existed, yes, but the infrastructure was primitive. Travelers carried everything they needed or hoped to find hospitality en route. There was no systematic network of supply stations. The Vikings built one by necessity. They had to. Their expansion strategy, raiding, trading, settling across vast distances, only worked if ships could move reliably. Reliability required infrastructure. Infrastructure required cooperation across crews, settlements, and generations. So they built it. Not through centralized planning. The Norse had no empire, no bureaucracy. Through distributed cooperation. Each crew maintained the camps they used. Each settlement supported the network. Each generation passed down knowledge of routes and stopping points. It was organic infrastructure, bottom-up organization, emergent complexity from simple rules. Maintain what you use, share what you can, cooperate, because failure to cooperate means death. Modern logistics experts study Viking maritime networks because they achieved efficiency that shouldn't have been possible with their technology. How did they move so fast, so far, so reliably with just oars and wool sails? The answer is infrastructure. The same way modern supply chains enable complexity through logistics, Viking expansion was enabled through their network of camps and bases. They didn't conquer through strength, they conquered through systems. But even this wasn't the full secret. The camps were critical, yes. Without them, Norse maritime dominance would have been impossible. But they were support infrastructure, necessary but not sufficient. The real secret was deeper. It lived in the ships themselves, in design choices that went beyond functionality into something closer to organic engineering. The Vikings didn't just build boats that could handle Arctic conditions. They built boats that actively helped crews survive those conditions. The ship wasn't just transport, it was shelter, insulation, heat retention system. It was a carefully designed environment that minimized heat loss and maximized human survival. Understanding that design, seeing how Vikings engineered their vessels to be partners in survival rather than just platforms for travel, that's where the full truth emerges. And that truth is darker, stranger, more brilliant than anything Hollywood has ever shown. Because the Vikings didn't just master fire prohibition, they replaced fire with something better. Something built into every plank, every rib, every carefully placed strand of tar-soaked rope. The ships themselves were the secret. And what the ships could do, what they were designed to do from keel to mast, that knowledge was the Vikings' greatest advantage. The knowledge that let them own the frozen seas for 3 centuries. The knowledge that died with them. Until now. History is full of voices that were silenced because no one chose to remember. Don't let this story be another echo that fades away. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications because if you don't, this too may vanish, just like the civilizations we talk about.